Are we ready to start? Should I start it off? All right, great. Welcome everyone to today's event, a guest lecture with the illustrious Dr. Gayatri Gopinath entitled Unruly Visions, the Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora, also the title of her new book. For those of you inside the Zoom, you are welcome to access automatic closed captionings by going to the menu at the bottom and pressing live transcript and pressing show subtitles. My name is Serenity Ju, and I am the director of the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities, the UMIH. We're housed in the Faculty of Arts, and we were established in 1990 to foster research and scholarship in the humanities across the university and the wider Winnipeg community. Please follow us on Instagram at UMIH_. We are incredibly pleased and flattered to join forces with the U of M's School of Art Gallery, also known as the Cool Kids on campus, to host Dr. Gopinath's lecture today. Thank you to Blair Fornwald for inviting us to collaborate. And also thank you to the School of Art Gallery team, Jean and Caitlin, for all the coordinating and production of this event tonight. Both the UMIH and the School of Art Gallery are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and we are also on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We hope that this ongoing colonial history of theft and occupation can frame our discussion tonight, including locating our individual positions within our local contexts as settlers, Indigenous peoples, arrivants, or visitors. To quote from Dr. Gopinath's newest work, referring to the oft contested relationship between colonialisms, post-colonialisms, and indigeneities across disparate parts of the world. I just have a short quote. The aesthetic practices of queer diaspora thus provide us with the critical model of engaging with difference, a model that does not see past difference, but opens the possibility of forging alliances in and through it. Such a model evinces a deep understanding of conjoined pasts, presents, and futures, and envisions, indeed insists upon, the possibility of affiliation amongst non-equivalent and at times even oppositional formations. I just thought that was one of many perfect quotes to frame the lecture tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Christina Hajar, who will introduce Dr. Gopinath. Christina Hajar is a queer feminist, feminist, first generation Lebanese Canadian artist, writer, and cultural worker based on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Her artistic and curatorial interests consider domesticity, labor, and place through diaspora, body archives, and cultural iconography. She was the 2020-2021 curatorial intern at the School of Art Gallery, University of Manitoba, where she curated Cause to Become, a group exhibition on queer diasporas, along with this lecture. Welcome, Christina.
Hi, thanks so much for that introduction and for starting us off. I want to encourage anyone to turn on their cameras if you like, no pressure, you can leave them off. And I have some words prepared. So first I wanted to point out we do have live transcription. So you can turn it on at the bottom panel where it says CC/live transcript. And you can feel free to drag and drop that wherever feels best for you. You'll notice we also have ASL interpreters at this talk, and their names are Christina and Cindy, and they'll be switching back and forth. So thank you both for being here. Jean, are there directions about how to access the ASL and specifically?
They're both pinned right now,
Okay.
but folks can spotlight them for themselves if they would like as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Before I get to introduce you to this iconic lecturer tonight, Gayatri Gopinath, I'm going to talk a little bit about the exhibition Cause to Become at the School of Art Gallery. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of the work while I talk. Am I going to do that? No, I'm going to talk first and then I'll show you a photo because I just realized if I share my screen, you'll see my notes. Okay, so the Cause to Become group exhibition was formed around queer diaspora. It includes the artists Wes Harmon, Mariana Munoz Gomez, Florence Yi, and Hagera Salam Shimbi Zagaya Gebrahewat. I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot, but if you want to turn your cameras on and wave, you can do that. You don't have to do that, but I know you're here, so thank you for being here. There's Florence. Wes gave a clap. Mariana. Okay. And Shimbi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Awesome. Okay, so a few months ago, my friend and mentor, Nazreen Himada, recommended Gayatri's book to me. It's this one, Unruly Visions, The Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora. I immediately connected to it, especially because of the value Gayatri places on aesthetic practices over aesthetic forms, which feels relevant to my interest in queer and trans becoming and feminist process. I see this as an anti-oppressive, decolonial methodology that is deeply poetic and philosophical. Understanding myself within queer diaspora and forming affinities and affiliations with other queer diasporic artists and thinkers allows for alternative roots to form, where I may embrace liminality, longing, and sentimentality as generous, invaluable sites for becoming. Gayatri's affirmation of non-normative life paths and theorizing around states of suspension was generative for me in conceptualizing the group exhibition, Cause to Become. To cause to become is to render. Being a queer, trans, or two-spirit, Black, Indigenous, or person of color in a hostile world necessitates art making as a validating method of identity exploration, intimacy, and world building. I chose the title Cause to Become because of the way turning towards artistic process opens the door for a heightened engagement and contextualization of aesthetic practices. Gayatri describes the space of in-betweenness as a state of productive suspension, not a stuck place, but one that's generative and active in challenging heteronormativity, homonormativity, gay and immigrant respectability, and the Canadian or American dream. Recognizing that these aspirations are superficial, restrictive, and oppressive, how might identity and art work to liberate us? Queer diaspora draws from multiple sites of experience where memory, repetition, and defiance are utilized to make way for alternative spatial and temporal orientations. Gayatri writes about how the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora impact our sense of space, place, and time, disorienting and reorienting us, shifting what we see and how we see it, and enabling what she describes as new forms of affiliation and relationality. In Cause to Become, the artists demonstrate the value in remembering, imagining, or anticipating home or place, and constructing alternative modes for becoming. Through Unruly Visions, I became motivated to curate through a consideration of artistic process and methodology, as opposed to crafting a more distinct thematic grouping. This framework opens the potential for transcultural exchanges and dialogues, where queer diaspora, in its overlaps and its multiplicities, may nurture intimate relations and creative defiance through autobiographical aesthetics. So hopefully that gives you an impression of the exhibition and a quick introduction on some of Gayatri's ideas, which have been influential to me. You can make a gallery appointment to see Cause to Become until May 14th. And while you're there, you can also see 2 other shows curated by Blair Fornwalt. A Story in the Middle with Catherine Blackburn, Lucienne Dury, Melanie Monoceros, and Audie Murray. And then there's also Night Garden by Keith Batty. I'd like to say thank you again to Serenity Zhu and Akene Maduka at the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities for partnering with us on this event. And thank you to the School of Arts Gallery staff, Blair Fornwald, Donna Jones, C.W. Brooks, Jean Borbridge, C.L. Cottle, and Casper Stein. Thanks to the staff at the School of Arts for their support, particularly Trevor Baziuk and Kaylin Harrison. And Kaylin's here tonight on tech support. So if you're having any issues, you can message her in the chat box under the name like SOA, so SOA Gallery Tech. Finally, I'd like to thank Noor Bangu, Nazreen Himada, and Blair Fornwald for guiding me through this process. My curatorial internship at the School of Art Gallery was made possible through funding support from the Government of Canada through the Young Canada Works program, Building Careers in Heritage. And this talk is being live streamed to YouTube right now, and we'll have time at the end for questions. You can do that in the chat box to me directly or publicly for anyone. And now I'd like to introduce Gayatri Gopinath. So Gayatri Gopinath is a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at New York University. She works at the intersection of transnational feminist and queer studies, post-colonial studies, and diaspora studies, and is the author of 2 monographs, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures, and Unruly Visions, The Aesthetic Practices of Queer Diaspora. She has published numerous essays on gender, sexuality, and queer diasporic cultural production in anthologies and journals such as Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, GLQ, and Social Text. Welcome, Gayatri.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was such a beautiful introduction. And I'll say a little bit more about it as we go on. But I want to begin by thanking Blair, Jean, Serenity for inviting me, for arranging my visit. I know it's a lot of labor to do these events, especially on Zoom. So thank you so much for doing that. Thanks to the ASL interpreters, Christina and Cindy, and Kaylin as well for tech support. So I want to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you right now from the unceded land of the Lenape people. I invite you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And today, we're discussing these questions of diaspora, dwelling, displacement, and I think it's particularly crucial to really center our commitment to dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism as we do so. And I really appreciate, Serenity, you quoting that passage from my book. Thank you so much for that beautiful reading of it, and the way you connected it to precisely thinking through as I said, our commitment to dismantling the legacies of settler colonialism and thinking about difference and how we can actually do real solidarity work. So I appreciate that. So it's such an honor to be here, and particularly to be in conversation with Christina. Christina shared her curatorial essay with me, and I have to say I was just so moved to see the ways in which my book resonated for her. And as a critic, as somebody who writes about visual art, I can honestly say there is no greater joy than to see my work actually taken up and used and sort of brought to life by the kind of curatorial work Christina is doing. And I'm particularly thrilled that a lot of the artists in the show are here. So honestly, this is such a joy for me. So thank you all so much for being here. So given that, queer diaspora is sort of the central concept of, that Christina's working with in the exhibition, what I thought I'd do today is map the ways in which I theorized the concept in my first book, Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures. And that book came out in 2005. And then I'll trace for you the ways in which I use the concept now in the second book, Unruly Visions, that was published in 2018. And Christina did such a beautiful job of sort of distilling sort of the crux of that book. but I'll say more about it. So, my piece, what I'm going to present is about 35 minutes. And then, I'm hoping we'll engage in a more sort of informal dialogue, both with Christina and with all of you. Okay, so let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the central question in some ways that's at the heart of both my books, both Impossible Desires and Unruly Visions, is how do we read queerness across difference, right? Whether that difference is temporal, whether it's geographic, cultural, racial, etc. So, all my work is centrally concerned with the question of visuality and in thinking about how queerness emerges in the space of the visual or doesn't emerge in the space of the visual. So just to give you a little bit of background as to where, all my work comes from, and particularly this first book, which was published a long time ago now in 2005, for me, there was a real urgency to write this book. It emerged out of my dissertation. I imagine there are some folks dissertating in the audience as we speak. So it emerged out of my dissertation, which was over 20 years ago, right? Which in turn had emerged out of the kinds of organizing and activism in New York City that I was a part of in the mid-1990s. So for me, the ways in which I saw questions of race, of migration, of diaspora being contested and lived really every day in the kind of queer immigrant organizing that I was a part of, I didn't see that being theorized in the academy. So I really didn't have sort of theoretical models to draw on to articulate the ways in which I saw these really complex negotiations happening around sexuality, migration, globalization, race. So that was really the impetus for writing the dissertation and then the book. So for me, what's at stake in Impossible Desires is first, I was very invested in intervening into existing Euro-American centric forms of queer scholarship that really sideline questions of race and migration, right? So I wanted to ask how foregrounding those questions actually forced us to think very differently about standard tropes of gay subject formation, like the closet and coming out, secrecy, disclosure, invisibility, visibility, relations to home, to family, to the domestic space. All of these concepts, right, had a very different valence when you place a racialized migrant subject, right, at the center, right? So that's what I wanted to map in the book. So that's why I actually began the book with an evocation of this film. I'm not sure how many of you know about it, My Beautiful Laundrette, that came out in 1985. It's a British film, brilliant film that came out now, 35 years ago, with a screenplay by Hanif Qureshi, who's a British Pakistani writer. And to me, it's still one of the best representations of queer interracial desire that I've seen on screen. So it portrays the relationship between a white punk, played by Daniel Day-Lewis in his first role, and a young British Pakistani man in Thatcher's Britain, right, of the 1980s. And this is a scene where they're about to have sex, and Omar abruptly calls a halt. He stops the interaction by recalling the memory of seeing Johnny march in a fascist parade when they were younger. And so this is what I say about that scene. If for Johnny, sex with Omar is a way of both tacitly acknowledging and erasing that racist past, for Omar, queer desire is precisely what allows him to remember. Indeed, the barely submerged histories of colonialism and racism erupt into the present at the very moment when queer sexuality is being articulated. Queer desire does not transcend or remain peripheral to these histories, but instead it becomes central to their telling and remembering. So what I'm trying to get at here is that queer desire is a kind of portal. It's the kind of conduit to the excavation of these barely submerged memories and histories of race, migration, and colonialism. So queer desire doesn't transcend these histories. It's not this kind of romantic narrative of love overcoming all at all, right? It's actually, queer desire actually emerges from out of this muck, right? It emerges through it. And in fact, their desire for each other is fueled in some ways by these histories, these violent histories. So that's why I think the film is so important, because it sort of frames queer desire in this context of race, migration, globalization, class hierarchies, etc. But what I found the kind of limit of the film is that it wasn't able to imagine queer female desire or queer female bodies anywhere in its frame, right? So I argued that a film like My Beautiful Laundrette, which foregrounds gay male desire, right, really has no room for queer female bodies or female desire. So the sole female character in the film, a young British Pakistani woman, quite literally occupies the sidelines and literally disappears from the film's frame. So Impossible Desires begins where a film like My Beautiful Laundrette ends, right? By foregrounding queer female desire and subjectivity. But I'm not doing this simply as an inclusion project, right? It's not simply to say, hey, look, we need to include this heretofore invisible subject. What I'm doing in the book is arguing that the erasure of queer female desire and queer female subjectivity is actually a constitutive absence within conventional nationalist and diasporic discourses that are completely invested in framing the woman, right, the female figure, as this bastion of tradition, as upholding, so-called sort of normative values. So within those nationalist and framings that are replicated in the diaspora, right, queer female desire and subjectivity quite literally cannot be imagined. It's rendered an impossibility, right, within these conventional notions of home, of community, of nation. And hence the title of my book, Impossible Desires, right? It's quite literally referencing the impossibility, not simply of queerness, but really of queer femininity, queer female bodies and desire within these hegemonic nationalist and diasporic discourses. So what that means is that articulations of queer female desire, right, have the potential to disrupt, to challenge, to explode these discourses, right? And so that's what I'm trying to do in the book, is to point to these places where we see these representations of queer female desire actually rupturing and messing up the workings of heteronormativity, as well as white normativity. So one of my chapters talks about this film Fire that came out in 1996. I thought it was a really interesting case study in some ways. It's actually the 25th anniversary of this film, so it's kind of a good moment to sort of look back at it. It's directed by Deepa Mehta, who you may know is an Indian-Canadian director. And it depicted the relationship between two sisters-in-law in a middle-class joint family household in contemporary New Delhi. And it shows the ways in which their relationship moves from female bonding and female friendship to female homoeroticism, right? So the film was circulated in film festivals, in Europe and North America. And then it had a screening in India. And it played in India with, in art house sort of theaters for a couple of weeks. And then the Hindu right got a hold of it. And there was a huge controversy around it because Hindu extremists, the Hindu right was in power at the time, as they are now in India. And Hindu extremists ended up burning down theaters, ransacking the theaters, issuing death threats to the directors and to the actors, etc. And so, these Hindu nationalist forces, right, were were arguing, and you saw this in the right-wing Hindu nationalist politicians and what they were saying at the time, they were arguing that lesbianism, as depicted in the film, is alien to Indian culture. And of course, by Indian culture, they meant Hindu culture, right? Or what they imagine as Hindu culture. So they were framing lesbianism and homosexuality in general, but particularly, queer female desire as anti-national, right? What I found very interesting is the way in which there was a kind of mapping of queerness, right, as inauthentic, as anti-national, right? There was a mapping of that framing of queerness onto diaspora. So the argument was not only that lesbianism was antithetical to Indian culture, right? The argument was being made that Deepa Mehta, as a diasporic filmmaker, was also anti-national, right? That she was inauthentic, that she had no, she was somehow not worthy, not able to sort of speak for the nation, right? So we have this kind of mapping of queerness onto diaspora, where both are seen as somehow inauthentic, as sort of unworthy imitations of the original, right? Whether that original is the national culture or whether that original is heterosexuality, right? So that's what really interested me, the ways in which queerness and diaspora were actually both framed as outside the boundaries of the nation. So the film also interested me because it situates queerness within the space of the home itself. So I think we're very used to narratives that depict queerness as only being able to exist outside the space of the home, right? Particularly the immigrant home or the racialized home, right? There's a sense that you have to leave in order to come into your full gay formation. And what I think Fire does, and in fact, all the films and cultural texts that I look at in the book, is I'm much more interested in how queerness actually emerges from the interstices of the dominant, right? From the interstices of the home itself, and remakes it from within, right? So in this film, for instance, there are some very beautiful scenes where the women are massaging each other's feet at a family picnic, or oiling each other's hair, right? And in that way, they're sort of transforming these sanctioned models or modes of female homosexuality, right? Of women simply together showing affection to each other. They're transforming that into these homoerotic acts, right? So what they're doing is sort of strategically maneuvering within these seemingly oppressive locations, right? So queerness then erupts, right? In the fissures and the cracks of the dominant, right? Rather than existing outside of it. And I thought that's a really interesting model of queerness that challenges conventional sort of Euro-American centric notions that only sees queerness in particular bodies and in particular places. So queerness cannot look like this, and it can certainly not look like, and it cannot exist within the space of the home itself, right? So a film like Fire was, putting forward what I would say is a kind of queer femme aesthetic, right? That was very much drawing from classical Bollywood cinema. So a whole chapter in my book talks about sort of queer Bollywood, right? The queer moments in Bollywood cinema that we can glean through what I call a queer diasporic reading practice, right? So what I'm arguing is that we need a different way of looking, a different kind of optic through which to read queerness outside of Euro-American contexts. That outside of those contexts, it can look very different, right? It can look, for instance, like this. It can look like hyperbolic, excessive femininity. But we see that through this kind of queer reading practice, that femininity is actually disassociated from heterosexuality, right? Rather than signaling one's availability to heterosexuality. And that's what I really appreciated about Fire, is that it, the femininity of the women does not signal their availability to heterosexuality. It's actually their refusal of it. So there are all these scenes where they're dressing for each other, they're putting jewelry on each other, they're putting saris on each other in this very beautiful way. So it's drawing, you know, the film I think is really drawing from this kind of aesthetic that we see from classical Bollywood cinema. So I wanted to just show you this clip, if I can get it to play, from this film, Razia Sultan. This is a classic Bollywood film from 1983, where Hema Malini, who's a very big Bollywood star, plays a Mughal princess, right? And she's being tended to here by her lady in waiting. And so I want you to look at this scene because it depicts this, you know, quite explicit moment of female homoeroticism in a film that's otherwise, you know, staunchly heteronormative. So let me just see if I can get the clip to show. It's just about 2 minutes long. Okay. So hopefully you get the picture there. Let me get my screen back. So what I love about that scene is that, you know, first of all, it happens within the space of the song and dance sequence. So anybody who knows sort of classical Bollywood cinema knows that this is the space of fantasy, where all kinds of things happen in the space of the song and dance sequence that are not narratively related to the rest of the film, right? And so what I found looking at Bollywood cinema through this kind of queer lens is that it's precisely in the space of the song and dance sequence that you see these moments of queer desire, queer pleasure, queer identification emerge. And so this is a great example of that. So you have the white feather that passes over, or pink feather that passes over their faces as they kiss. On the one hand, you know, that's for the film censor board that does that until not that long ago did not allow kissing on the Bollywood screen, right? So it's the screening device. But I also think it's referencing the ways in which, you know, queerness kind of on the Bollywood screen sort of eludes a certain logic of visibility, right? It's not about sort of saying, it's not about characters sort of asserting their queerness in these sort as identity, right? It's actually a kind of doing rather than a being. And this is what Christina in her intro sort of referenced, right? That I've been interested throughout, the ways in which queerness doesn't solidify in these moments into identity structures, right? But it's actually more of a practice. It's a doing rather than a being. So, you know, again, like in Fire, you see these moments of queerness emerge in these sites of apparent extreme gender conformity. Here it's in the space of the zanana, which is the women's quarters in a traditional Muslim household. So what interested me in Impossible Desires in my book was how queer audiences, both in South Asia and in the diaspora, seize onto those moments, right, in these films and make them the kind of building blocks of queer identification and spectatorial pleasure, right? You know, these are not moments that have a life in the rest of the film, right? They often simply emerge and then they disappear. And this is another example of that. This is a film called Hum Aapke Hain Kaun, one of the most popular Bollywood films of the 1990s, a huge hit. Deeply conservative narrative, right? Extolling sort of Hindu family values, normative kinship, capitalist consumption, you name it, right? But at the same time, right, in the midst of this deeply conservative narrative, right, you have a moment, and I wish I had the clip to show you, but I couldn't find it. You have a moment where suddenly there emerges this gender nonconforming character, right, who starts dancing very suggestively with the female heroine of the film, Madhuri Dixit. And, again, it's this brief moment of this brief queer incursion that interrupts the seamless quality of heteronormativity in the rest of the film. And so what I was arguing is that, a queer reading practice seizes on those moments, right? And takes them sort of further than they would want to go. And that's what I saw happening with, within my sort of queer South Asian community, where, it was amazing to me how these particular moments, there was a tremendous sort of agreement around which moments in Bollywood cinema, sort of fed people's fantasies, modes of identification, modes of desires they were growing up. And often it was these particular moments that these queer spectators sort of held on to. And as I said, sort of made the building blocks of their own queer embodiments and desires. So, what I'm trying to give you a sense of is how, ultimately all my work is interested not so much in endless excavations of the dominant, right? It's much more interested in alternatives and possibilities and trying to sort of glean alternatives and possibilities. So that's what I'm trying to tease out in these various readings of visual representation that I engage in this first book. So let's move on now to Unruly Visions. So in a lot of ways, the book is an extension of my concerns and impossible desires, in that in both books, I'm really trying to articulate a queer diasporic theory of visuality. In Impossible Desires, what I named a queer diasporic reading practice was in fact a practice of seeing, right? Because I was arguing that a queer diasporic frame allows us to see both diaspora and sexuality differently, right? So in in Unruly Visions, I'm mobilizing what I call a queer optic that brings into focus these intertwined histories that traverse the South Asian diaspora, but that also exceed it. And so this is where I think the second book moves beyond the first book, in that Unruly Visions is really interested in thinking about the intertwining and the intimacies of different diasporic trajectories, right? Not just South Asian. So the book actually begins and ends with this Lebanese artist, Akram Zaatari, who's a queer Beirut-based artist. And I put Zaatari's work in conversation with South Asian texts, with African-American, Latinx, indigenous work, right? And so, the book's method is in fact juxtaposition, or what I call queer curation, where I juxtapose seemingly incommensurate texts to make apparent the resonances between them. And, again, I go back to that quote that Serenity read from the book, where I'm really interested in thinking about affiliation through difference, right? So it's not about sort of saying, oh, this is like that. It's actually saying, no, this is actually incommensurate. And nevertheless, there are resonances that we can glean between these different incommensurate formations. So to go back to the idea of curation, so there are different layers of curation at work in the book. I see the artists themselves that I write about as curators. That's specifically true with an artist like Akram Zaatari. So Zaatari, for instance, is working with a photographic archive of sort of vernacular studio photography in Lebanon. So he's particularly interested in the photographic archive of a studio photographer named Hashim El-Madani, who was from Saida in South Lebanon, who created thousands of images of Saida's residents from the 1940s through the 70s. And this is one of the images from Madani's collection that Zaatari replicates and puts back into circulation. So Zaatari, out of the literally hundreds and thousands of negatives that Zaatari finds in El Madani's studio, Zaatari chooses, arranges, reproduces, and emplaces these images, right? And puts them back into contemporary circulation, and in so doing, gives them a kind of queer meaning that they may not have otherwise, right? So I actually open my book with a kind of riff of coming across this image in a collection of El Madani's photographs that Zaatari had put together. And I talk about how this image in some ways kind of stopped me in my tracks, because there was something so familiar to me about this image across all this time and all this space, right? I felt like I knew this person. They were recognizable to me, right? As a kind of genderqueer figure that in some ways I recognized from my own young adulthood, watching the Queens on the piers on the west side of Manhattan. And so for me, my own response to this image, along with Zaatari's affective response to this image, right, raises all kinds of questions about sort of these queer trans-temporal relays of identification, right, that's happening across time and across space. It also raises the question of how we understand the photograph itself as evidence, right, as evidence of queer life. What does queer even mean in the context of South Lebanon in 1948, right? So all of those questions are raised in Zaatari putting these images back into circulation. So the introduction to the book is titled Archive, Region, Affect, Aesthetics. And it's really the interplay between all of those concepts that's really at the heart of what the book is about. So what I'm calling the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora are in fact archival practices, right? In that they're excavating alternative visions of the past that allow us to glimpse other possibilities in the present. I also argue that the space of the region is one that we can effectively mine for alternative logics of gender and sexuality. And in the book, I deployed this notion of the region in both subnational and supranational senses. Here, in relation to Zaatari, I'm talking about the region in its subnational sense. So I'm arguing, and I'll say more about that in a second, but I'm arguing that these aesthetic practices in some way transform regional archives, like this archive of El Madani's from South Lebanon, right, into queer archives, right, through a mobilization of affect between the art object and the viewer, right? So this is why Zaatari's work figures so prominently for me in the book, because it's actually his own investment. It's his own curation. It's his own excavation of these archival images that gives them this kind of queer meaning in the present. So the queerness of the work emerges from the relay, from the interaction between Zaatari as an artist and the images that he's presenting to us, and then between the affective relation that we as spectators and viewers have to these images. So I'm just going to show you a couple of images from the book. So this is the book that Zaatari created out of Hashim El Madani's photographs. Most of the photos in El Madani's archive are of, kids, weddings, etc., right? But what I find so interesting are the particular photographs that Zaatari, as this queer contemporary Lebanese Beirut-based artist, chooses to reproduce, right? And chooses to present to us, and the order in which he does that in this book, right? So he gives us all these like explicitly sort of homoerotic, homosocial images, of this kind of militant masculinity, right? This kind of hyper masculinity. And he himself has talked about, how as a queer child, his own queerness was deeply influenced by these militant freedom fighters, right? Syrian resistance, Palestinian resistance. That's what sort of fueled his own queer desire as a child, right? So what he's doing is sort of reproducing them for us and, imbuing them with this kind of queer affect as he sort of presents them to us. So here, another, particularly, handsome Palestinian resistant, right? But then what I find so fascinating is that Zaatari ends this whole series of images of this kind of hyperbolic militant masculinity with these images, a whole series of images of Abed the tailor. And you see Abed with a friend, that's what the caption says. And to me, and then you see him, posing in these ways. You see him with his sister. And so to me, what these images connote is, a kind of the ways in which queer subjects were deeply embedded and rendered mundane and everyday in the life of the city at this moment, right? There's nothing actually spectacular about Abed, right? He's sort of embedded in this kind of rich network of friends and family, right? Perhaps lovers, right? And so that's the memory that Zaatari is sort of conjuring into the present for us through his presentation of these images. And then we have these images that Zaatari gives us, right? That he gleans from El-Madani's archive. Intimations of homosocial kinship, affiliation, love, desire, right? And then finally, he ends with these images, which he calls Scratch Portrait of Mrs. Bakari. And, if we have time in the Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about these images, which are so striking and sort of chilling in a lot of ways. So to me, what he's doing is sort of conjuring forth this kind of homosocial militant masculinity, talking about, articulating the ways in which it fuels his own sort of gay male subject formation, but at the same time, referencing the ways in which that masculinity is always shadowed by its negatives, right? By those who are lost to history, the gender queer figures, queer desire itself, female figures like that of Mrs. Bakari. So what Zaatari allows me to get at is what I'm calling a kind of queer regional imaginary, right? And here the region I'm deploying in a subnational sense. And, in the book, I'm particularly interested in how alternative gender and sexual formations may exist in the space of the region, right? In these sort of spaces that are sort of sidelined within nationalist historiography and occluded within nationalist historiography. And so what Zaatari is doing is excavating this kind of regional photographic archive from South Lebanon and bringing its queer valences to the fore, right? So that's one level of curation at work, right? The kind of work of curation that the artists themselves are doing for us as viewers. And then of course, I as a critic, am also doing a kind of curatorial work by placing these artists in conversation when they wouldn't be otherwise necessarily. So with that, and I'm mindful of the time here, I'm going to take just about 7 more minutes or so to talk about another chapter in my book, where in order to give you a sense of how this method of queer curation functions, right? How it can function to sort of surface unexpected juxtapositions and resonances, right, between dissimilar formations. So this chapter in my book is entitled Queer Disorientation, States of Suspension. And it juxtaposes the work of an Indian American artist, Chitra Ganesh, alongside that of a Los Angeles-based Latina filmmaker, Aurora Guerrero. And I thought, I wanted to reference this chapter because this is the one that Christina draws on in her curatorial essay. And so, a lot of the ideas around deviation, disorientation, suspension that she picked up on and rendered so beautifully in that essay that she wrote come from this chapter. So I wanted to say a few words about it. So, one of the things I'm trying to show in my reading of this film is that, and one of the reasons I put Guerrero's film in conversation with a South Asian American artist is to show the ways in which they both challenge standard narratives of immigrant aspiration and immigrant life through a queer lens, right? So each, I would say, really repudiates what Lauren Berlant, the critic Lauren Berlant, terms the good life fantasies of racial, gender, sexual respectability that determine one's entrance into the US and I would say probably the Canadian nation as well, right? As an immigrant, right? Whether you are South Asian or Latinx or Lebanese or any other, coming from any other geographic location, there's a way in which, you know, it's very clear what it means to be a good immigrant, right? So this chapter is really, this chapter of the book is really about how, in order to confront, you know, extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric that we certainly see in the US at this moment, you know, immigrant rights advocates often appeal to a kind of respectability politics that's all about normative notions of family and kinship. And of course, we see that normativity replicated in mainstream gay rights movements that have argued for inclusion through a recourse to normative family structures such as gay marriage. So what I'm saying is that the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora, which I would say a film like this is an instance of, right, offer us another vision of relationality, of affiliation, of orienting yourself, of directionality that really repudiates those sort of conventional good life fantasies. So just to say a little bit about the film. So the film can be described as a kind of coming of age narrative. It shows the kind of intensity of female friendship between these two teenage girls, both Latina, and shows the ways in which this relationship tips into female homoeroticism, right? Within the space of the immigrant home. And so in that way, it's similar to a narrative like Fire. What I love about the film is that it's set in an in-between space, right? That we can actually understand as a kind of queer region. And so, you know, it may seem really disjunctive for me to go from Akram Zaatari and, you know, South Lebanon to this film, but in fact, I see them both as articulating, you know, what I'm calling a queer regions, right? These spaces that are sort of outside of the purview of the nation, where perhaps other logics of gender and sexuality exist. So in this case, you know, it's set in Los Angeles, which is of course a global city, but it's set in this immigrant enclave, right? This immigrant neighborhood called Huntington Park, which is in a sense a kind of indeterminate space. And the filmmaker Guerrero has talked about how she wanted to set it not in East LA, which is actually quite a famous Latino enclave, right? She wanted to set it, as she puts it, in this space just west of East LA. So I think there's something minor about this site that I find really interesting, right? So it's set in this in-between space, but it's also set in an in-between time, right? In that in-between space of adolescence. So the film in some ways is really about being minor, right? It's about the minor being minoritized, being in a minor space. And it's also kind of a minor story, right? Nothing really happens in the film. It begins and ends in the middle. And I would say that the film itself was seen as kind of minor. It circulated for a few weeks in movie theaters and then it kind of disappeared. So for me, you know, the film, so let me just say, so the film depicts these two working class girls from these Mexican immigrant backgrounds. And Mari, who you see in this screen, in this slide, is undocumented. And living in the state of absolute neoliberal precarity. And the film is very good at showing the kind of affect of neoliberal precarity. As I say here, the affective landscape of neoliberalism, which is primarily that of exhaustion, right? It's about a continuous state of vulnerability and exhaustion. And so, for Mari, the only way out of living in that state of precarity that is offered to her is through relentless work. And so you see her constantly trying to hustle to just make a few dollars in order to give to her mother, who's a factory worker, right? So she engages in forms of sex work, passing out flyers on the street, etc., right? So that's one dead-end avenue, is through constant labor, right? The other avenue out that's offered is through education, right? But Mari, as an undocumented young person, is shut out of that avenue, right? So what happens when queerness enters into this landscape? For me, my reading of this film is that queerness really disorients and disorganizes this kind of neoliberal logic and the neoliberal landscape that the girls inhabit. So as I say here, queer desire, relationality, and identification function as a kind of propulsive force that throws one off a normative life course and into a different life trajectory that is in fact open-ended with no fixed itinerary or ending. So queerness is this kind of disorienting force that throws the girls into a different trajectory, away from the kind of progress narrative that is sort of, that is enjoined, right? That is demanded of them to adhere to. So you see the film depicts them in these spaces of disuse and detritus, right? You see them in a space of what I would call a kind of state of suspension, right? You see them on this bicycle that Mari has, where they sort of ride around in circles. They're actually not going anywhere, right? You see them walking along these disused train tracks. You see them in cars that don't move, right? That they can't drive. And, you see them in, this burnt out garage that actually becomes their space of enacting a kind of queer intimacy and imagination. So it's in these spaces that are really, again, sort of at the interstices of the dominant, that sort of fall out, that are spaces of disuse and disrepair, that they use in order to craft a different kind of logic, right? That I would call a kind of queer logic. So what I'm suggesting here is that, and I think Christina really pointed to this in her introduction. What I'm suggesting here is that perhaps if we dwell in these spaces of suspension, as uncomfortable as they may be, it may open up a different way of being and doing, right? Different kinds of relationality can emerge that cannot be envisioned or imagined within normative sightlines. So we do, as Christina said, think of suspension as being stuck, right? But perhaps we can think of it more as a kind of momentary pause that allows us a different vantage point, that opens the way to new landscapes and new horizons outside of the heteronormative and its suffocating good life fantasies. So, as in my first book, what's at stake for me in this book is really about imagining alternatives, right? Because our lives really do depend on imagining alternatives, rather being acquiescing to the here and now. And of course, I'm quoting from my dear departed colleague, Jose Munoz, and his notion of kind of queer utopian futurity, which I think the girls are actually sort of striving towards, right? So I look to the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora as sites of possibility, as sites that make evident the kind of commingling of our pasts, our presents, our potential futures, and sites that make evident the kind of connections that exist across geographies, across social formations, and across temporalities. So the book is very much about entanglements, overlaps, intersections, intimacies, right, of both histories and geographies. And, ultimately it's really about radical relationality. Again, to go back to that quote that I'm so grateful that Serenity started with, right? How do we think about our fates as deeply intertwined with those that we imagine are completely dissimilar to us, right? So, I think Christina's exhibition is actually really picking up on the notion of sort of affiliation through difference and radical relationality. So with that, I'm going to sort of stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Christina to start us off with our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we all just turn our mics off, or I mean on, and give some like applause? Like, let's make some noise. Because we're really missing on that feedback with these live events. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks, Gayatri.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was wild. I wish that I could take a class with you. Mariana also texted me that too.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you so much for your work, for your words, and tracing your work for us. I really appreciate the way that you draw on films to talk about queerness, diaspora, affiliation, and space. I'd like to welcome the audience to ask questions as well. So I have some questions prepared, Serenity does, and we would also like to welcome anyone here. So if you want to put your question directly into the chat box, you can do that either publicly or directly to me. Or if you'd rather ask your question out loud, you can just say in the chat box, like, I have a question, and then we'll make sure that you can just use your voice. If you're watching this on YouTube, also feel free to pop your question into the chat box there, and we'll make sure that I read it out loud. But just to start us off, why don't I ask the first question while people are thinking? That was kind of like a mic drop. Like we're probably all like stunned and don't have a lot to say, but luckily I prepared a question.
Absolutely. I just want to say, I know it's hard to sort of listen and absorb and then sort of come up with a question. So no pressure, everyone. This is really just like a easy conversation. So yeah.
Totally. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, I guess I was just, you mentioned this in your talk and also in your book about how writing is a form of curation for you. And by placing the artist's work in dialogue with one another, that is a form of curation. So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you see as the relationship between curation and writing, or art and writing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for starting us off with that. And Christina, I really want to hear from you too, because, and Blair as well, because, I'm talking about myself as a curator in a sense, but of course you all are the real curators. So I'm very happy to know that, the way I was thinking about queer curation actually resonated for you, Christina. So for me, I'm thinking about curation. I go sort of to the root of the word, which comes from to care for, right? And so I was thinking that that's really what we as critics do, right? We care deeply about the objects that we write about. And for me, caring about the work means being attuned to its context, being attuned to the ways in which it resonates with other texts, and really sort of sitting with it, right? And so for me, like that's the method that I use when I write. And this is what I tell my students, always start from the object, So my theorizing emerges from this deep care for the object itself, right? So sitting with that photograph of Abed and seeing what it tells me, seeing how it speaks to me, that's how the theorization happens, rather than a kind of instrumentalist mode of fitting the art object into a ready-made theory that you have. So I find, I see that kind of instrumentalist way of using art, using art practices, and I really want to sort of shy away from that. So yeah, so I think for me, writing is a mode of curation. And in this book, I'm taking a lot of risks, putting Zathari in conversation with Saidiya Hartman and, doing all kinds of juxtapositions, with Alan D'Souza's work, who's a Kenyan Indian artist. But I think it's worth it because, these are juxtapositions that actually typically don't happen within sort of traditional art historical frames, right? And so, it's putting these artists in conversation and allowing a kind of dialogue to emerge from that sort of juxtaposition that may not otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. It seems like just the way that you said, like sitting with the work and allowing the work to inform the lens with which you work rather than trying to do it backwards, which is actually the way that most people are taught, which is placing the theory onto the object or the art.
I'm curious, Christina, like when you put this show together, how did you approach it? Because it seems to me like, again, you're working with these artists who are, working in different media, coming from these different sort of diasporic trajectories. So how did you find the kind of logic to thread these together? Because I'll say that, the struggle in writing Unruly Visions was finding the kind of logic, right? Sort of sitting with the art objects and then finding the logic.
Yeah, for sure. Like, honestly, I even kind of had that overthinking moment as well when I was reading your book and I was like trying to make things fit into the way I was learning them from you. And then I was like, am I like using this theory properly? And then I was like, okay, that's actually not the point of this. And at the heart of this writing is to really just approach this work through relationships and through emotional something. I want to say like paths to one another. And like on the first thing that I was looking for was actually I was wanted to curate an exhibition around dwellings because I was very taken by what you were writing about, that in response to these like oppressive systems, we can like foster abundance through everyday forms of dwelling. And I'm interested in like the notion of pleasure activism, and I was thinking a lot about the everydayness of queer diaspora. And so that was actually my jumping off point, was thinking about things through the idea of dwellings. And then later when I was sitting with your work some more, I realized that it was more so the states of suspension that I wanted to emphasize. And actually all of the artists in the show are people that I knew already. So I had been in a mentorship with Palestinian curator and writer Nazreen Hamada, who taught me a lot about curation and curating through care, ethical responsibility, and relationship building, and how that is like at the core of what the whole point of this is, and that these things should be able to exist outside of the institution, and that galleries are a space that can house these ideas and these projects, but at the heart of this work, it really is just about relationship building. So, and this was the first like solo curatorial endeavor that I did, kind of like I had like the first like gallery exhibition that I did on my own. I really like to work collaboratively. So actually I was kind of flailing, trying to figure out like how I wanted to work for what felt like such a big moment. And so I just asked the artists, I talked to the artists about your work and the idea of dwellings. And then they told me what they wanted to contribute. And then there was kind of like a back and forth. So that was also another way that I tried to be foster a more like reciprocal curatorial process, was not by placing like my idea onto the artist, but by like sharing ideas and seeing what might happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I mean, I love what you're saying about a kind of ethics of relationality, you know, and that's really what's at the heart of this, is actually creating those kinds of relations, right? You know, what you said about collaboration is really interesting, and how you really want to work in collaboration. And in fact, you did, you know, you're collaborating with the artist, right? And I like the way you put that, this kind of reciprocal curatorial process. And I have to say, like, when you're writing, you know, especially when you're writing a book or you're writing a dissertation, it can feel extremely solitary. And so for me, it was really important for me to actually create a relationship with the artists I write about. And so for the most part, except for one artist, I really do have a kind of back and forth relation to everyone I write about in Unruly Visions. And that was incredibly important to me because, you know, what's interesting is that we don't necessarily always agree on the reading of the artist's work, you know, but there's a real kind of, but we both kind of draw on each other's reading of the work. So Zathari, for instance, I didn't know him at all, you know, and I approached him and I said, look, I'm really interested in writing about this. And I was a little bit nervous about, you know, the way in which I was deploying queerness in the work. I didn't know if that would resonate for him. And, you know, that was perfectly fine for him. And he actually really appreciated that reading. What he was pushing against was that I was framing his work as the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora, because he was saying, I chose to remain in Lebanon, right? I did not leave. And for him, there was a real point of pride in that, whereas so many of his contemporaries sort of, you know, so many of his contemporaries did leave, right? And so he didn't like that framing of himself as diasporic. But at the same time, you know, he's from Saida, he's from South Lebanon, the place that Hashim al-Madani is from. And so, you know, he has this kind of relation to this place that I do think is diasporic, you know, and it's rooted in a kind of temporal remove, as well as a certain kind of geographic distance, even though Lebanon is a small place and there's not much distance between Saida and Beirut, but there is culturally, you know. And so I think, you know, there is a kind of diasporic sensibility at work in his work. And so, but we were kind of disagreeing on that, you know.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so, but I think, you know, that's what happens when you're working with artists that you're ethically committed to being in collaboration with, right?
Yeah, I appreciated the way that you framed space and diaspora, because like we talk a lot about how borders are fake and like, but if you actually think about what diaspora means, then if we consider the region rather than country to country migration or displacement,
right,
then the whole concept of movement or displacement changes. And then that opens the door to really honoring Indigenous experiences of diaspora as well, which I learned from your book as well, which was which talked about noting the erasure of Indigenous experiences of diaspora. But meanwhile, like, Indigenous peoples are constantly living in diaspora as well, and even within like Treaty 1 territory, even if your lineage is originally from Treaty 1 territory, you might have been displaced from one region to another. So
precisely. And so, I was trying to really work against the notion of diaspora being here and indigeneity being there, and really trying to think of this sort of slippages and overlaps between those concepts and those experiences. So thinking about diasporic indigeneity, diasporic rootedness, right? And, again, I think the artwork speaks to that. And so, one of my chapters that you're referencing draws on the work of Tracy Moffat, who's an Indigenous Australian artist. And, to me, her work really sort of is precisely about what I called in that last slide, sort of dwelling in displacement, right? The ways in which diasporic rootedness is kind of the place that all of these texts are drawing on, right? Or speaking to, right?
Thank you. I'm going to turn over to a question here from Florence. The question is, this is perhaps a very contemporary problem, but how do we contend with the queer diasporic reading / seeing while evading queer baiting?
While evading
queer baiting.
What does queer baiting mean?
Florence, oh, that's my dog. Florence, do you want to clarify the way that you're using that term?
Yeah, sure. Queer baiting is a tactic mostly used by very recent media, not super recent media actually, but it has historically, it has roots in the fact that in North America and other like Western colonial cinematic universes, villains and many other like negatively coded characters are queer coded, or written as queer because of that assumed moral negativity, but also that in very contemporary ways, like films that have come up in the last 5-10 years, even in like so-called positive protagonists, queer baiting is used mostly as a way of reeling in queer audiences without specifically in text specifying that these characters or these people are queer. So I'm wondering, I guess like in most of your examples, they are textually queer, but that some of them are not. And I wonder if there's, I guess, like something to be thought of there.
I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but, I'll say that the texts that interest me, and so this is why Mosquita Imari interested me, is I'm interested in forms of queerness that don't necessarily congeal into identity formations. Because as you're saying, often when they do congeal into identity formations, at least historically, as you mentioned, the queer coded character is sort of vilified, killed off, victimized in some way, right? And so, to me, when I looked at the kind of history of Bollywood cinema and thinking about, how does queerness emerge in this genre, what I saw is that when the character, as you're mentioning, when the character is explicitly coded as queer, they are invariably the butt of jokes, they're killed, they're brutalized, or as you said, they're the villain, right? And so I was much more interested in looking at those moments of queerness, as I said, that aren't intelligible as queerness unless you're reading it through this kind of queer lens, you know, through what I'm calling this kind of queer optic or queer diasporic reading practice that can pick up on those momentary sort of incursions of queerness, you know, that emerge in unexpected places. So that would be my response, but I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're talking about, the phenomenon, the recent phenomenon that you're talking about.
Thank you for your response. Yeah, it's a very, I think, queer baiting is maybe something that happens, especially in like youth media, and perhaps is like, well, hopefully something that will not continue on much because there is a lot of public discussion about it, I think, but maybe my circles are very, very contained.
No, but thank you for that. That's important for me to know that that's happening.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Serenity, did you want to ask a question?
Sure, of course. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. Who knew that we were going to get kind of Gayatri Gopinath 101 from herself? It's incredible. And it's, you know, to hear you talk about your older work in a different way. It's not that old even. It's just been kind of wonderful. And I was struck by, you know, kind of how you're moving from your first book to your second book, or your first project to your second project. And how you identify, you know, in the first book, these ideas, these moments of queer moments of encounters, like in the touch or the look, or the pose, even, that those are those, like you can kind of identify those moments, which is kind of practice of seeing. And also just the lovely ways in which you kind of word that as moments of erupture and emergence. And then in this Unruly Visions book, I feel like you're saying that there's a shift where now you're saying queerness actually makes space. It forms a new kind of space. So, and you just talked about this idea of, you know, kind of resisting an identity formation, which it just makes so much sense that I feel like just from how you're conceptualizing your two book projects, that you're saying that queerness is a space making practice, which is where the kind of curatorial practice comes in. And my question was, because you also talked about, you know, in the context of that film that you were looking at the very end, that in this neoliberal landscape, queerness has also become hypervisual or hyper visible. I'm sorry, like it's everywhere, right? It's selling us Tide and just everywhere. And I'm wondering, are you perhaps suggesting that there's something really fragile about this neoliberalism that's allowing for a queer remaking of space? Or like, what has happened, I guess, maybe that's what I'm asking, from what has happened maybe in your shifting from that idea of looking for those fissures and moments of queerness to actually considering queerness as a production, a space-making production.
Well, that's such a beautiful framing. And I wish I'd thought about that when I was, because
that's what you said.
You are articulating it, but I wish I'd said that explicitly, because I do think that's exactly what's going on in the second book. So thank you for that. I think that's just so insightful. So I love the way you put that, you know, queerness as a kind of space-making practice. And I think that's exactly right. And in fact, that's why the notion of the region is interesting to me, because if we think about, you know, so I'm really, you know, thinking about different spatial scales in this book more explicitly than I am in the first book. So, you know, thinking about the scale of the region as a kind of subnational site that is sort of a space at the side of the road, you know, to quote Kathleen Stewart, you know, these spaces that don't rate as being able to be emblematic of the nation. I mean, I think that's what's really interesting about a space like South Lebanon. And Christina, as somebody from a Lebanese background, I'm curious what you think about this, but there is a way in which South Lebanon is this kind of anomalous site that can't fully be integrated into the nation. And And so, to me, what Zathari is doing, for instance, is evoking what is perhaps a kind of alternative logic of gender and sexuality that exists outside of these kind of national spaces that we can call sort of these queer regional sites. And it's tricky because I do think it's an imagining of what that region is. It's not necessarily what it really is. It's about how he imagines it, in this kind of in this kind of contemporary imagination. But it's doing a certain kind of work for him. There is a way in which it allows for, there's something important about bringing that memory, however imagined it is, into the present, because it enables a sense of possibility that doesn't exist in the present without it. But anyway, so I really appreciate what you're saying about, queerness as a space-making practice. And I think that's why I'm drawn to these different spatial scales, like region, for instance, and thinking about, I think Christina mentioned, region to region connectivities, ways in which we can sort of think under the radar of the nation in some ways. Anyway, so let me just stop there. Yeah, I know we're almost out of time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really fantastic.
Does anyone else want to ask a question before we close up? We're at that time now, but we can do one more, perhaps.
Scratch portraits. Yeah, Blair. I mean, those photographs are so fascinating, and I do a whole read of those scratch portraits of Mrs. Bakari in the book. But to me, what I think is really significant is that Zathari isn't just sort of reclaiming and sort of queering, this kind of homoerotic, homosocial, these homoerotic and homosocial images. He's not simply sort of querying that for this kind of gay male sensibility. He ends with those images, right? And so to me, it is about like how even this kind of masculinist rendering of the past, even when it's queered, has the capacity to sort of efface female bodies and female subjectivities. And I think Zathari is sort of foregrounding that and sort of cautioning against a kind of easy reclamation of this kind of male homoeroticism. So I'll just sort of leave it at that. But thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, I think we will wrap here. Thank you, Gayatri, so much for your writing, for your lecture today, for engaging with the exhibition as well. And thank you to the Cost to Become artists who are here, to the ASL interpreters, Cindy and Christina, Kaylin and Jean for doing tech support tonight, and Blair for being here as well, and Serenity and Akene at the Institute for Humanities and Research. So
well, I just want to say, Christina, you've been such a wonderful interlocutor, and it's just been a joy and a pleasure. So thank you so much for what you're doing, and congratulations for this exhibition and for bringing all these artists together. It's really remarkable. So I look forward to, really, paying attention, like really doing some careful looking at the show, and also, looking at your own solo show. So congratulations for all your achievements. It's really wonderful.
Thank you so much. Just totally gushing right now. So, yeah, I'll be thinking about this talk for a while. And for those who are in Winnipeg, definitely make a gallery appointment to go and see Cause to Become. And then while you're there, there's also 2 other shows to see, as I had mentioned. And in 3 weeks from today, we'll have the second event that's in conjunction with Cause to Become, which is a reading by Mariana, who's here, of her new artist book, Mapping Place. And that's it. So yeah, stay tuned for exhibition photos and a video tour if you're not in Winnipeg, or if you are choosing distance and not going to galleries right now.
Thank you all so much. Take care, everybody.
So,
Okay.
have a good night. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you both, everyone.